So basically today I'll go over an overview of the competition as well as the timeline and where to purchase different parts for the robot. I'll also go over kind of the design process for a competitive robot in VEX. I'll also go over engineering notebooks and the judging process, which is a big part of the competition, as well as various programming tips, as well as like activities and further resources you can look up to learn more.
Thank you.
So like Ms. Anna stated, I'm currently studying computer science and math at ASU. I did a couple seasons of first Lego League, one at my elementary school and the second with Mrs. Anna at Education Empowers. After that, I did 3 seasons of VEX at my high school. And currently I work with a nonprofit, 18 by 18 AZ, and we basically volunteer at different tournaments around the valley, and we help out with the technical side of running them. So basically, in the VEX Robotics competition, each team builds 1 robot. And in a typical match, there's 4 robots and 2 alliances on a 12 feet by 12 feet field. And it's basically 2 robots versus 2 robots. So you get an alliance partner with you. And matches are 2 minutes long. And so it's split up into an autonomous period at the beginning of the match, and it ends with a 1 minute and 45-second driver control period. Basically, the autonomous period is where the robot acts on its own. So if you've done first Lego League, it's kind of like similar programming where you're telling the robot to do specific directions and spurs. You're programming the robot to do specific actions, basically, in a sequential order. And the driver control period is where each team has like a driver and they manually operate the robot from a controller. And then another part of the competition is the robot skills challenge, where it's only 1 robot on the field and you have 1 minute to score as much as you can. So as for the timeline, basically the season starts in April at the VEX World Championship, where they reveal the new game. They make like a cool animation or video explaining the game rules, and they release the game manual. And then after that is the qualifying tournaments. So in Arizona, this is typically in late October to early February. And you can register for as many tournaments as you want. Obviously, if you register for more tournaments, it'll become more expensive. So there's that caveat. And then there's also, if you do well at the qualifying tournaments, there's a state championship. In Arizona, this is typically late February and early March. And then if you do well at the state championship, you can qualify for the World Championship. For the next few years, I believe is being held in Texas. And that's typically held in late April. So tournaments are usually take up 1 day. And it's kind of like a similar time commitment to a first Lego League tournament, where you start at 7:30 a.m. and the award ceremony is usually around 5 or 6 p.m. So it starts with inspection, where basically the event makes sure that your robot is legal and it fits within the size limit. And usually robot skills challenges also opens up at that time. And then after that, there's the qualification matches. And each team is usually guaranteed 6 or more matches per team. And you get random alliance partners and opponents. And it's also important to note that the judging happens alongside qualification matches, and I'll go into more detail about judging later on. And then so after the qualification matches are over is the alliance selection process, where basically the top ranked teams from qualification matches pick their alliance partner for eliminations. So it's kind of like a complicated process, but like essentially in summary is the team that's ranked first after qualification matches gets to pick their alliance partner. And so their alliance partner can either accept or decline the invitation. And once they have an alliance partner, then it goes to the next highest ranked team. and so on and so on. And so after all the alliances have been formed, there's the elimination matches, which is a single elimination playoffs bracket. And then after that is the award ceremony where you're given awards based on robot or judging performance. So as for where to purchase your parts, VEX sells like a competition super kit to help teams get started.
Maybe we can ask if there's any questions on the previous slide from the...
Was there any questions? Yeah.
No, I'm good.
Oops. I have a question.
Yep.
Please go.
Okay, I'm sorry. It's hard on Zoom, especially since I'm not on the monitor. I'm wondering, so this means, so what we're talking about right now is I would start my new team in October. Is that how that works? So my students, I have students who are interested right now. So this is not for anything that has to do with from January to May of this year.
Yeah, so generally for schools, we usually organize teams at the beginning of the school year.
Yeah.
And then the teams start building, and then they, at ACP, our first tournaments that we register are usually mid-November. So usually between like August and November, where it's usually like building. As for right now, I think at the end of the presentation, we'll go over like activities you can do to like help your class get started.
Okay.
So
Okay, that's good. Sorry, thank you.
no worries.
Josh,
no
I
problem.
also have a question, Josh. After school starts in August, let's say you put a team together, and then what do they do from October to early February? Did you say the competitions are in February? So are they building and programming in October, November, December, January for 5 months?
Yeah, so between like when tournaments start and up into the state championship, teams are usually constantly iterating on their design, and they're like constantly improving it. So yeah, mainly building and like improving specific parts of the robot.
And when does the competition actually start?
So the date of the first tournament usually varies. Typically is like the 3rd or 4th week in October.
Around fall break.
Yeah, roughly.
Okay. So they have about a couple of months to build it and get ready for the first tournament, you're saying?
Yes.
And then between October and February, how many qualifying tournaments they have to go through each team?
So it depends on like what each team is kind of looking for. And so you can qualify, if you're really good, you can qualify at one tournament and not go to any others until the state championship. Usually what ACP has done is we usually try to give each team like 4 or 5 qualifying tournaments to go to improve their skills ranking or to try to qualify through an award. So did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I think so. It could be anywhere between 1 to 5 tournaments.
I will say that there's a downside to like going to too many tournaments where you just kind of start to get fatigued.
Okay.
And you don't get like a lot of like good time to like really make any big changes to your robot.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Was there anyone else who had a question? All right. So yeah, basically, yeah, so VEX sells like a super kit. To go to that page, and it basically kind of like comes with a lot of like different metals and small parts that will help like start your team up. And like there's like kind of like a list of what it all comes with. So you get your robot brain, controller, a battery, and some motors. And you also get like wheels and all the different seed channels for building your robot. And some other recommended purchases are safety glasses, which are required at competitions. And then also extra motors and batteries wires, because unfortunately sometimes motors get broken and it's nice to have more batteries or more wires to use. As for field elements or field tiles, so it's typically not required to buy the entire field. It can be useful, but typically you only buy as much like field elements as you need. Usually like VEX will sell maybe only maybe like half of the field elements or half the game elements. And then you can just buy as many as you need. Another useful purchase are the foam tiles, which the robots run on in the field. And that will help make your autonomous programming more consistent. And so besides that, there's storage bins, which I can also where to like purchase those at the end of the presentation, and like zip ties, rubber bands, and like tools to cut metal. So VEX sells their metal in specific lengths. And so it can be useful to like cut longer pieces of metal into like shorter pieces of metal if that's something that you need.
So Josh, I have a question, Josh. So is this a super kit? Every year you have to buy one of these, or is it like one time you buy and you can use it for
You only need to buy it once.
You only need to buy it once. So, but then what is it that you have to buy every year for the competition?
So every year you have to register your team.
Okay.
If I recall correctly, that's 150 for your first team and then 100 for other teams in your organization.
Okay.
And then there's also competition registration fees, which are usually like $60, I think, per tournament.
Okay. And the field and those things that you showed, like say when we do first Lego League, when we register for first Lego League tournament, then along with it we get everything, right? We get except for the robot, we get the mat, all the Lego pieces, everything. So is that a separate purchase or does it come with the registration?
So when you
All these, yeah.
Yeah, so when you register a team, you're usually given a few
Of these.
game elements, and that
Okay.
could be one of the bigger elements.
Okay, got it.
So yeah.
Okay, so I think then if you one year, if we buy that $1,800 kit, super kit, then we can use it every year.
Yes.
Okay, and then just pay for the registration fees. Now, how many students did you say is on per team?
Yeah, so this goes nicely into the next slide.
Okay.
So usually in terms of team organization, usually 46 students per team is usually ideal. And then like schools can have multiple teams also. And it's important to note that smaller size teams and larger size teams can also work, but you probably have to like put more effort into like dividing work properly or like maybe meeting more often if you're a smaller team. And team roles are also pretty fluid. So you usually have like 1 to 2 dedicated programmers and everyone else usually focuses on building. But like if let's say my teammate needs help building something, then I'll usually like stop programming for the time being and just help them with their build. And like likewise, if I need help testing my program, usually one of my teammates is willing to help me like reset the field or offer feedback. And then at competition, when you go up for your match, there's only 3 students allowed at the competition field, and it's just known as your drive team. Usually one of the 3 students are going to be like the driver, so like operating the controller. And then you also have like a drive coach, which is a student, and they usually like spot different game elements to score for you. As for team meetings, I would recommend like at least 2 hour minimum for a meeting or more, and also like a few times a week. That's kind of what ACP did throughout the year. And I'll also expect to meet more often leading up to a tournament. And then as for a build area, you pretty much only need like 1 to 2 tables, and like in addition, like probably space to store like the robot and your parts. So does anyone have questions so far?
So did you say they have to meet at least a couple of times a week?
That's what I would recommend.
Okay.
So you say, so pretty much it's 4 hours. It's a 4 hour a week commitment. And then when you get closer to tournaments, it's even more.
Yes.
Okay.
Like I would say it's also possible to like meet less, but I would say like maybe like some students can work on programs outside of meetings, or like research stuff outside of meetings. But yeah, 2 hour meetings a few times a week is what ACP did. And I think it was a nice balance. Did anyone else have questions?
There's a lot of commitment.
Yeah.
Yeah, for first Lego League, we meet once a week. For a couple of hours, once a week. But you're saying VEX, we have to meet at least 2 times a week.
Yeah, I think that would be most effective.
Okay.
All right. So basically when you're designing your robot, you want to ask yourself goals. So like, what do you want to like learn or achieve? So like maybe do you want to qualify for states, or like how well do you want to do at states, for instance? And you also want to like design your robot around your game strategy and not vice versa. And in general, like it's only a good idea to like follow the engineering design process, since like, and this will like help for judging, since like judges like to see that you followed a design process. And it's also important to note that robots can be broken up into different subsystems. So you might have a subsystem for the drivetrain, a separate subsystem for the lift, intake, etc. So for as terms of breaking down the game, so basically each game will have like a game manual, and it's really important to read the game manual and understand the definitions. And you want to list the actions that a robot can complete to like score or enables the robot to score. So for instance, this might be like pick up object A, or climb object B, or shoot object C. And you also want to acknowledge the ways that your opponent can deny you from scoring. Since if you recall, like VEX is like a 2 versus 2, and you want to score higher, you want to score more points than your opponents, and sometimes your opponents will want to keep you from scoring to win. And so once you've done listing your actions, you want to determine which ones are worth doing, and you want to prioritize them, and this will help you come to a game strategy. So for brainstorming, you want to brainstorm individual mechanisms for each action. So maybe for example, for picking up an object, you might brainstorm a claw or like a roller intake. And in this phase, you don't really want to rule out ideas yet. And it's also important to note these in your engineering notebook, which I'll go into later. And so you also should probably like, or want to research previous games for inspirations, as robot actions may be similar, but you also don't want to blindly copy them or blindly copy other robots, but rather you want to understand what made them effective. And so like, for instance, like a mechanism that was made for a game a few years ago might be similar for this year's game, but it would have like, it might been like for a different sized object. So just keep that in mind. And YouTube and VEX Forum are both good resources for research. VEX Forum is basically like an internet forum where like VEX students and mentors, coaches can talk about robotics. And so it's also a good idea to prototype individual mechanisms to prove that it's feasible or to fix initial issues. And like before, it's a good idea to write the results in the engineering notebook. So basically, once that's done, you basically just use the information gained from your researching phase to design a complete robot. And a few notes. So you want to keep the robot simple, and this will do a couple things. It'll make it easier to build, and you'll have less points of failure. And you'll also want to find ways to make an active mechanism a passive one. Also, a few examples of these later in the next slide. And another important notes is you want to evaluate your design after competitions. And this is known as kind of like the iterative design. So you want to ask, did it meet your goals and priorities? Or does anything need to be changed or improved? And it's also a good idea to note this in your engineering notebook because judges will really like that. So are there any questions before we go on?
I have a question. Why? Okay, so I don't understand. You have underlined, do not design the robot for 18 inches, shoot for 17.5 max. What?
Oh.
Why? I don't even understand what that's about. If they're asking for 18, you don't want to go up to 18?
Yeah, so in VEX, there's a size limit for your robot. So at the start of the match, your robot has to fit within an 18-inch cube. And that's one of the things that they check at inspection. And so when it says shoot for 17.5 inches max, that means like you want to make sure that there's a margin of your like between like, so to make sure your robot fits within 18 inches.
That makes sense. I'm sorry, I didn't understand the reference. Perfect.
No worries, I didn't really explain that clearly.
That's okay. No, that's okay. I got it.
So yeah. Yeah, the
You have
18
a
inch.
picture of the robot on the previous pages. Is that the height that you're referring to? When you say 18 inches?
Yeah, so on the left is like a robot that just completely fits within 18 inches. Wait, yeah, on the left. And then on the right is a robot that's kind of like completely expanded. So after the start of the match, robots are generally allowed to expand up to a certain limit. So on the right, that robot was designed for a game that had no limits for vertical expansion. And so after the start of the match, where it had to fit in the 18-inch cube, it was able to like rise up and make a really tall stack for that game.
Understand. Thank you.
No problem. Okay. So this is like kind of like an example of iterative design. This was in my senior year. In October, November, we started with a robot that was kind of heavy and slow. And we completely changed our design for December, where it was a lot faster and more nimble. And then we kind of like improved specific parts of that design in February and March. So yeah, you can see the improvement. And then another thing that I want to note is finding ways to make an active mechanism a passive one. And so, like I mentioned earlier, the robots have to fit within an 18-inch cube. And as you can see, like the robot doesn't clearly fit within 18 inches. So what we did for that was instead of using motors to have the tray flip out, we used rubber bands to keep the tray folded in. And when the robot started to run, the tray would flip out automatically. So that's an example of using a passive mechanism instead of an active mechanism. Does anyone have questions?
Good, thank you.
So the engineering notebook. So if you've done science fair in the past, it's kind of similar where you have a daily log of your progress. And so some key points are you want to write frequently. So ideally you want to have an entry for every day your team meets. And you also want to make sure they're as quality as possible. So for instance, when you're explaining how you made a design option, you also want to explain why you did not choose other options. So like if you're choosing between options A, B, and C, and you go with options B, you can explain why you chose option B, but you also want to note why options A and C were not selected. And also information should be easy to find. Usually tables are a great way to organize data, and printing pictures and graphs are also very helpful. And if you want to go above and beyond with the engineering notebook, on the robotics education page, which is where you can find more competition information, they have a rubric for the engineering notebook, and also where to find that at the end of the presentation as well. So one of the bigger differences between First LEGO League and VEX is that unlike in First LEGO League, where your judging presentation was like an actual presentation where you had like lines to rehearse and like maybe a PowerPoint, judging in VEX is more of a conversation between the students and the judges. And so at competitions or tournaments, teams are usually guaranteed 2 interviews throughout the competition, and they happen kind of like on the spots. So like in between your qualification matches, the judges might come up to your pits and say, hey, do you have time for a conversation? And so, yeah, and if you're in contention for one of the judged awards, you usually get interviewed 3 or 4 times instead of 2. So if you find the judges coming to your table like a 3rd or 4th time, then you know you're really in contention for one of them. And one important thing is that you want to make sure that everyone on the team speaks without being prompted by the judges, since that'll show that everyone worked on their robot. And like I mentioned earlier, judging is a natural conversation, so you don't want to prepare like a presentation, but rather you want to keep in mind the topics and points you want to emphasize. So to practice this, you might have a coach or mentor ask sample questions, which can be found in the judge's guide. And some example of questions the judges might ask is like, hey, can you explain to me your design process over the course of the year? Or they might ask, I noticed that you chose this specific design. Can you explain why you did not choose other designs? Or they might ask you how the tournament is going and if anything unexpected has happened and how you're dealing with that. So does anyone have questions on that section? All right.
Good, thank you.
So teams have a few options to choose when it comes to programming a robot. You have like a few different choices of language. I underlined C and C++ because they're the most commonly used. So the first option is VEX code, which is officially supported by VEX. Another option is Robot Mesh Studio, which supports a lot of languages, including Python. And it's also easy to set up in which that you can basically write your code in an internet browser instead of like downloading a completely new software for your computer. It's supported by Robot Mesh, which is a company based in Washington State, and they basically resell a lot of parts for the Northwest region. And so this is where you can find it. So let's go to that quickly. So let me see. So this is kind of what it kind of looks like, what Robot Mesh Studio kind of looks like. then you have options up here for running and building your program. So there's that. And then the third option that I'll mention today is Prose. It only supports C and C++, and it's more work to get started in Prose, but there's also a higher ceiling, and is also maintained by students at Purdue University. So if one of your students or you have experience with C++ or C already, and you're willing to put in the work to get started with it, I would definitely recommend Prose. So this is the website for Prose, and you can find the documentation here and how to get started. So there's that. And so basically what I recommend to like learning to code for robotics is to set goals and then learn what it takes to program them. So for instance, maybe you want to keep the robot's arm up automatically by itself. Then you would learn how to do PID control. Or maybe you want to learn how to use an autonomous selector. And then in that case, you would learn how to use how to create a graphical user interface programs, or GUI. And there's a lot of free tutorials or videos online for learning programming. YouTube and Google are going to be really helpful for learning how to code. And all VEX programming options have like their own tutorials and documentation for how to use their platform. Okay, so does anyone have any questions so far about this little section?
I have a question that you might answer it further down. How many adults are allowed to be like mentors or coaches on a team? Because this looks like a lot of people have to wear different hats. I might be great at building, but I'm not great at coding, or vice versa.
Yeah, so to my knowledge, there's really no limit for mentors or coaches for a VEX team. Like I mentioned earlier, usually a student will specialize in programming, and that's pretty much going to be 90% or 80% of what they'll probably do on the team. So yeah, did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. All right. So
usually one adult coach or two adult coaches, like in first Lego League, or we have two coaches, adult coaches needed for a team. Is there any requirement like that?
So the minimum is just one coach.
Okay.
Specifically, they just have to be like an adult contact, and they have to be present at the tournaments as well. So that's like the bare minimum, but yeah.
The mentors, they can have many, you're saying?
Yeah, you can have as much mentors as you want. So like there's no limit on mentors or coaches. The only like requirement is you have to have one coach at the tournament and as like a adult contact for the team.
Thank you.
Yeah. Did I answer your question?
I think so. Thank you, Josh.
All right. So sensors. So there's a lot of sensors for VEX. Motors, for instance, have telemetry built into them. So you can get how much a motor has spun for, or you can get the temperature data for them also. Another sensor that you might be familiar with is an ultrasonic sensor or a distance sensor. So let me annotate. So this one here is the ultrasonic sensor, and it pretty much works the same as an FLL, where it measures distance. And then this one right here is kind of like the newer version of that. But they both work the same way, essentially. The next one is a line tracker, which I don't have pictured here. Essentially, there's a white field tape, white tape on the fields that you can follow or detect with them. There's also limit switches, which are basically binary on or off, like the switch is either pressed or not pressed, and that's really useful for detecting if a lift is resting. And then you also have potentiometers and rotation sensors, which they measure rotation, but only in like a fixed, like only within a fixed angle. And the upside to that is that you get a lot more precision. So if you need to be really accurate with an angle, then a potentiometer or a rotation sensor will be really good for that. The GPS sensor here is new this year, I think. And it requires the GPS field tape to use and is currently only allowed for robot skills. And then the last sensor I want to make a note of is the vision sensor here. And it's not something that I would recommend for a competition use, since the, like basically the lighting at each competition you go to can be slightly different to what you program in the classroom. So there's just a lot of variability with it, and that's why I don't really recommend it for competition use. So like I mentioned earlier, there's a autonomous period and a driver control period. And so this is kind of what the functions would kind of look like. All three of the programming options, like I mentioned before, have like competition templates. So they'll usually give you these functions and places and point you to where you need to write code. So for instance, in driver control, you have a specific place to write code to run once. And then you have another place inside the while loop to write code to run all the time. And in the autonomous, you have like the function to place all your code in. So for driver control tips programming, a quote that I heard, I forgot from where, but basically your job as a programmer is to put the driver out of a job. And what this means is you want to automate common or repetitive tasks that the driver does. So like, for instance, if a driver takes 5 seconds to complete an action, then if you can automate that action into a macro, then the robot will likely do it faster than the driver. And so that'll free up some more time for the driver to complete more actions and score more points. And you also want to avoid using code that blocks program execution for a long time. And what this means is you want to avoid using additional loops inside of your driver control. So like if you have another while loop or for loop inside of this while loop already, then you run the risk of blocking your code execution. I should ask, does anyone have questions about this slide?
I'm good.
So as for autonomous, a lot of advice from First LEGO League will stay the same here if you've done that program, or if you've done that competition, I guess. So tolerating error is really important. So for instance, the game element placement will vary slightly from match to match, or different fields may have issues. So you want to be prepared for variance. And you also want to have a consistent method of placing your robot. So I'll try to find like a marker on the field in terms of like how the game elements are placed, and always place your robot at that one position. And it's also a good idea to have multiple autonomous for each side. So let me pull out my pen. So basically, if you're on the red side, you want to have like 2 or 3 per side. So you can have one of your autonomous start here and the other autonomous start at the bottom side of the field. And programming an autonomous selector can be helpful for that. And another advice is, and this is also for in general, but you also want to talk to your alliance partner before the match to figure out which autonomous to use so you can avoid running into each other, and also so you can score the most points possible. And so where the multiple autonomous per side comes into play is let's say your alliance partner can only start in the top corner. And so if you have autonomous for the bottom side of the field, that means that you can both run your autonomous programs. So some general programming tips. I would recommend to back up your code on GitHub or Google Drive. You'll likely be bringing your programming laptop to competitions everywhere, and in case something happens to it, you probably want your code backed up somewhere. I remember my senior year, one of the other teams at my school, they accidentally spilled some soda near their laptops, so that was fun to deal with. Another tip is to create reusable functions, and a good litmus test for this is if you find yourself copy pasting a lot of code, then that's usually a good sign that you should create a function instead. And the next tip is helpful for like if you work with other programmers on your team. So like if you have more than one, but it's also really helpful if you're the only programmer on your team, is to comment your code. So what this means is like, if I write a lot of code, then I want to like write maybe a few sentences or a few words about what it does. So a few months later, when I'm looking at the code again, I can immediately tell, okay, this is what this piece of code does. And the last tip is to use sensors creatively. So on the bottom right, I picture the line trackers. And what we use them is as proximity sensors. So how these line trackers worked is, if I recall correctly, they read like the infrared light that bounced off of surfaces. So what we found that if we placed an object really close to the line tracker, then the value the sensor would read, it would be completely different. And so we took advantage of that to detect whether a game object was near us or not, or that to detect if we were holding a game object or not. So does anyone have questions so far? All right.
Good, thank you.
So these are some like miscellaneous activities you can do to prepare for the next season. So the first is build a robot and program it. You can experiment building different types of lifts, intakes, etc. And maybe you don't have your parts yet. You can also practice CAD modeling. So CAD modeling is basically computer-aided design. So you can design a robot on your computer. Autodesk Inventor does have free licenses for students, so I'll look into that. And I think a lot of the VEX community also uses Autodesk Inventor, so you'll find a lot of supports for that specific use case of Inventor. As for programming activities, learning C or C++ would be useful. And you can also use Robot Mesh Studio or VEX Code VR to program a virtual robot and see how that's like. Another thing you could do is volunteer at tournaments. It's a really good way to meet teams and network with other teams. And it's also a really easy way to get a lot of volunteer hours. If you call, like each tournament runs usually until like 7:30 or 8 until like 5 or 6. So you can easily get like 9 or 10 hours of volunteering if you need to keep track of those. And a way to find tournaments is to go to robot events. And so basically to find competitions in your area, you go select VEX robotics competition, and then you want to filter for the United States and for Arizona. And it'll give you the list of tournaments that are in Arizona. And so I guess this is a good time to show what event pages look like. So for instance, maybe you're interested in this tournament. Generally, each tournament will have like some general info about the venue. So for instance, there's no food or drink in the gym at this event. You can get an agenda, and there's usually a section on volunteering. So for instance, if you're interested in volunteering at this tournament, you would email the club. And then there's also different useful tabs of information. So health and safety, for instance, team list, and what awards they're giving out there. So, yep. And then here's some more further resources. So like I mentioned, VEX forum is a good resource. It's basically like an internet forum where students, coaches, mentors can discuss about robotics. So here there's a question about one of the game manual rules. And you can just talk about strategy or robotics in general. Another really good resource is the Purdue Wiki, Purdue SigBots Wiki. And it's maintained by the same people who run pros. And they basically compile a lot of information on basically the hardware side of VEX and the software side of VEX. So for instance, maybe you want to learn about lifts. You have like, they go into different types of lifts. So for instance, double reverse 4 bars, and they go into, they have a lot of really good information. So I'll check that out as well. RoboSource is another place to sell or buy, miscellaneous parts. So more so like storage and tools. So this is kind of where that parts organizer I had earlier. And then the last resource is for just about the competition in general. So here you can find the game manual, which is a really large PDF. And yeah, so that's pretty much where you can find a lot of information about the competition. So this, and yeah, that's pretty much all I had for the slides. Does anyone have questions in general or go back to a specific slide?
I think you did a great job of explaining everything. I feel a bit overwhelmed,
Yeah, it's a lot
Not
of
be-
information.
not because of you, but because it seems like a pretty large undertaking.
Yeah, it's a lot to get started, but once you have a program running, it'll get easier.
So here's my questions. As far as finances go, it sounds like this is about a $4,000 or $5,000. By the time you get the robot and the stuff for the games and for entry fees and probably a small laptop that would be dedicated to the contests. Is that $4,000? Does that sound like the amount of money I need to find?
2000, I think, or anywhere between 3,000, 4,000 sounds right, I think.
Okay,
And that's, yeah, but like as you go into like your second or third year, obviously you don't need to buy the kit again every year.
right.
It may be like maybe more metal or extra motors. So,
Right.
yeah.
Okay.
And then a good fundraiser that ACP did was running a tournament. So for instance, if we go back to the event page here,
Mhm,
you see the registration fee is $65.
mhm.
$5 goes to the RUCF. So that means that for each team that registers for the event, the school keeps $60. And so that's a really good fundraiser for us.
Okay, that's cool.
So that's an idea for that.
This was really good summary for us. Thank you, Josh. Appreciate a lot.
No problem.